I have attended 417 academic conferences across 11 star systems. I have watched species crumble under the weight of their own pride. I have seen civilizations present their greatest achievements only to be politely, professionally, and very publicly dismantled by the review board of the Galactic Academic Consortium. Nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on the third day of the Consortium's annual Extinction Review Summit, held aboard the orbital station Varath Prime in the year 45 and 402 of the standard galactic calendar. My name is Dorvik Sharlan. I am a senior correspondent for the Interstellar Academic Press, which is exactly as boring as it sounds. I cover academic summits, extinction assessments, and species classification hearings. My colleagues consider my job a punishment. My mother thinks I wasted my education. My editor thinks I am the only one patient enough to sit through 14-hour deliberation panels without falling asleep or filing a complaint with station management. She is probably right. The summit was standard until it was not. Allow me to set the scene. The Grand Deliberation Hall of Varath Prime seats approximately 8,000 observers. It is a tiered circular chamber with holographic projection arrays running along every wall. The ceiling displays a live star map, which is either deeply meaningful or deeply pretentious depending on how much you have had to drink. The seats were filled that morning with academics, researchers, diplomats, and journalists like myself, all gathered to witness the Consortium's most anticipated session of the decade, the formal extinction classification of the planet Earth. Now, before you gasp, let me explain how this works. The Consortium monitors thousands of civilizations across the known galaxy. When a civilization enters what is classified as a terminal cascade, meaning a sequence of interconnected collapses across ecology, economy, governance, and social cohesion, the Consortium opens a formal review file. If the evidence crosses the threshold, the planet is entered into the extinction registry. This is not a death sentence. It is, the Consortium will insist with great diplomatic politeness, simply an academic acknowledgement of observable facts. Earth had been in review for 47 of their years. Professor Kavran Sollis, the lead assessor and a being who had classified 17 civilizations in his career, approached the central podium with the calm of someone who had already decided the outcome before breakfast. He was tall, grey-scaled, with the kind of posture that said, "I have never been wrong, and I do not intend to start today." His species, the Veth, are known for two things: their extraordinary longevity and their complete inability to be surprised by anything. I had interviewed Sollis once, 3 years prior. He had described the fall of the Miratic civilization with the same tone someone might use to explain the weather. The chamber quieted as Sollis arranged his data panels. "The assessment before this body," he began, his voice amplified and translated simultaneously across 38 languages, "covers the civilization designated Terran, primary species Homo sapiens, occupying the third orbital body of the Sol system." The review file was opened following a cascade indicator score of 73 points out of 100. The threshold for formal classification is 60. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. 73, whispered Prenny Dalcott, my colleague from the Outer Systems Digest, seated to my left. She was a small, four-eyed Sulvari, with a habit of narrating things I could already see. "That is higher than the Miratic score when Sollis classified them." "Yes," I said. "Thank you, Prenna." Sollis clicked through his first projection. It bloomed across every screen in the hall, a planetary health composite for Earth, red in almost every category: ecosystem fragmentation, atmospheric carbon saturation, political coherence index in the bottom 7th percentile of monitored civilizations, biodiversity collapse rate, accelerating, economic instability markers flashing like a broken navigation console. "The cascade indicators," Sollis continued, "have not merely met classification threshold, they have exceeded it across 7 of the 9 primary categories. The species demonstrates significant cognitive capacity, tool use, and technological development consistent with a Class 4 civilization. However, the evidence strongly suggests that this cognitive capacity has been applied, with remarkable consistency, toward the acceleration of their own decline." A few quiet laughs moved through the academic section of the gallery. Polite, professional, the kind of laugh that says how unfortunate, while also saying we are so glad we are not them. I noted this in my recorder. Audience mood, sympathetic amusement. Sollis proceeded to walk through the evidence with the thoroughness that had made him famous. 70 years of atmospheric data, Ocean temperature curves that looked like someone had taken a graph and decided to make it dramatic. Deforestation rates. Political fracture indices. Military spending compared to infrastructure investment, which produced a ratio so lopsided that there was a brief visible reaction from the delegate section where several species exchanged looks that communicated, wordlessly but clearly, they spent their resources on that instead of this. It was, I will admit, a compelling presentation, not compelling in the hopeful sense. Compelling in the way that watching something fall from a very great height is compelling. You do not want it to happen, but you cannot look away. The second hour covered social cohesion metrics. Here Sollis introduced something called the Internal Narrative Fragmentation Index, which measured how effectively a civilization's population shared enough common understanding of reality to coordinate large-scale cooperative action. Earth scored a 14 out of 100. For reference, the Miratic civilization, before their final collapse, had scored a 22. The Terran species, Sollis noted, clicking to a slide that displayed what appeared to be their communication networks, has developed technology that allows instantaneous global information sharing and has used it, primarily, to disagree about whether problems exist. The academic section was not laughing quietly anymore. Several delegates in the diplomatic rows were shaking their heads slowly. I recognized the particular head shake. It is the universal gesture for, this is very sad and also somehow deeply funny. I was writing as fast as my recorder would allow. Then came the segment I had not expected. Before this body moves to formal vote, Sollis said, and there was something new in his voice. Not hesitation, exactly. More like the practiced tone of someone who has been required to include something they find mildly inconvenient. The Consortium's review protocols require acknowledgement of any counter-submissions filed by parties with registered interest in the classification outcome. The hall stirred. There was one such submission filed, Sollis said. He clicked to a new slide. It displayed a submission identifier, a date, and the name of the submitting party. The name was Mira Vasili, species human, title independent research correspondent, Earth. The murmur that moved through 8,000 observers was not quiet. It was the sound of an entire assembled academia trying to recalibrate. Humans had observer class status with the Consortium. They were aware the organization existed, but a human filing a formal counter-submission to their own extinction classification, that had not happened before, not in this context, not at this level. Prenna grabbed my arm. Did you know about this? Absolutely not, I said. Is she here? I was already scanning the chamber, and then I saw her. She was seated in the observer gallery, third tier, section 7, which was absolutely not the section where you sat if you intended to address the hall. It was the section where visiting academics who had been given courtesy credentials sat, observers, non-participants, the people who watched and said nothing and left with brochures. She was human, which meant she looked, to my Veth-trained visual processing, like a small, soft-surfaced, bizarrely upright creature with forward-facing eyes and an expression I could not immediately classify. She appeared to be in the early decades of her lifespan. She was wearing clothing that was by galactic academic standards extremely casual. She had a bag, a physical bag, made of fabric. She was holding a device that I eventually recognized as an Earth-manufactured portable data unit, outdated by roughly 15 years of their technological development. She did not look like someone who had come to stop an extinction classification. She looked like someone who had taken the wrong transport and ended up at the wrong conference, and was too polite to leave. Sollis regarded the submission notification with the expression of a being who had never once encountered an inconvenience he could not process and file away. The submission has been reviewed for compliance with Consortium protocol. It meets the minimum evidentiary threshold for floor acknowledgement. The submitting party is present and may address this body for a period not exceeding 20 standard minutes. The hall went very, very quiet. The human stood up, and the way she stood up was, I have to tell you, one of the strangest things I have ever witnessed in 417 conferences. She did not stand up like someone addressing an 8,000-seat galactic academic chamber for the first time in human history. She stood up like someone who had been waiting for the bus and finally saw it coming around the corner. A little bit of relief, a little bit of okay, finally. She picked up her bag. She looked at the central aisle. She walked toward it. People were staring. 8,000 academics, diplomats, researchers and journalists, staring at one human walking down a central aisle in a fabric jacket with a 15-year-old data unit in her hand. Prenna had not released my arm, Mira Vasili reached the central floor, looked up at the podium, looked at Sollis, who had stepped aside with the grace of someone who had no idea what was about to happen, but was professionally required to pretend otherwise, and she stepped up to the speaking position. She looked out at the hall. The silence was the kind that has weight. And then she said, in a voice that was calm and clear, and carried absolutely no apology in it whatsoever, "Hi, I know you have a lot of data about us, so do I, but I think you are missing something, and if you give me 20 minutes, I will show you what it is." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, where breathing was a thing they did. Professor Sollis, who had classified 17 civilizations and had never, in 140 years of academic practice, visibly blinked at anything, blinked. I turned off my background audio filter and set my recorder to capture everything, because I had covered 417 conferences and I had never once seen anything like this. The holographic screens behind Mira Vasili flickered, and her data feed connected to the Consortium's projection system, which should not have been technically possible with a 15-year-old Earth data unit, a detail I noted in my recorder with 3 exclamation points and the words "find out how later." Her first slide appeared. It was not a rebuttal of Sollis's data, it was not a counter-argument to the cascade indicators, it was not a chart of hopeful projections or political promises or a plea for more time. It was a photograph. A single photograph of a coastline that had been stripped bare by industrial activity 30 years prior. In the foreground of the image, which was dated, there was nothing but grey sand and broken ground, and in the background, so small you had to look for it, were 2 figures, hunched over the earth, planting something. "This," Mira Vasili said, "is where I want to start." The hall was still silent, but it was a different kind of silent now. I have covered extinctions and collapses and reviews for 20 years of my career. I know what rooms sound like when they have already made up their minds. I know the silence of inevitability. I know the silence of formality. I know the silence of people waiting for something they have already dismissed to finish. This was not that silence. This was the silence of 8,000 people realizing, at roughly the same moment, that they might have made an assumption. "I know what your data shows," Mira Vasili said. "I live inside that data. I grew up in it. And you are not wrong about any of it. But your models measure collapse. They do not measure what happens when something refuses to stop." She clicked to her next slide. And that was when I stopped taking notes and just watched. I have a personal rule as a journalist: never get emotionally invested in a story. Report what you see. Record what you hear. File your piece. Go home. My editor, a wonderfully cynical Solvari named Preet Hakan, had drilled this into me during my first year on the job with the patience of someone who had watched too many young correspondents ruin perfectly good careers by caring too much about their subjects. I broke that rule approximately 40 seconds into Mira Vasili's second slide. The image that filled every screen in the Grand Deliberation Hall was not dramatic in the way Galactic audiences typically understand drama. There was no explosion, no sweeping vista of technological achievement, no monument to civilization. It was a graph. A simple, clean line graph. But the line on that graph was doing something that made Professor Sollis, classifier of 17 civilizations and professional unmovable object, lean forward by approximately 3 degrees. The line was going up. Not the bad kind of up. Not the atmospheric carbon kind of up that Sollis had shown in his own presentation. This line tracked what Mira Vasili labeled, in plain text, as localized ecological recovery rates across intervention zones. The graph covered a span of 60 Earth years. For the first 40, the line moved in the direction everyone in that hall had expected based on everything Sollis had presented. Down, steadily, depressingly, professionally down. And then it stopped going down. And then it went up. "This is not a global reversal," Mira said, and her voice carried the particular quality of someone who has decided that the most powerful thing they can do is not oversell. "I am not standing here telling you that Earth fixed itself. Your data is accurate. The cascade is real. What I am telling you is that your models classify civilizations as a single unit. You measure the whole, but the whole is not how change works on Earth. It never has been." She clicked again. The new slide showed a map of Earth. Scattered across it, in a color that sat somewhere between gold and green, were hundreds of marked zones. Small ones, some no larger than a neighborhood, some the size of a mid-range continent, but there were hundreds of them, and inside each marked zone, the data tag showed the same pattern the graph had shown. Decline, then stop, then recovery. Every single one of these zones, Mira said, was dead, or dying, or considered unrecoverable by local scientific assessment. Every single one of them was brought back by groups of people who were not governments, not institutions, and not funded by anyone with significant resources. Most of them were brought back by people who were told it was too late. Prenna had finally released my arm, which I appreciated, because the circulation was beginning to matter. She is describing informal cooperative networks, Prenna whispered. Yes, I said. The Consortium's models do not weight informal cooperative networks in collapse projections. No, I said, they do not. We looked at each other. Sollis, still standing to the side of the podium in the professional posture of a being who had temporarily ceded the floor, was now holding a data panel. He was scrolling through something. I could not see what, but the fact that he was scrolling at all was, for anyone who knew Sollis, roughly equivalent to another being visibly dropping their jaw. Mira Vasili moved to her third slide, and here is where the hall stopped being politely attentive and started being genuinely uncomfortably engaged. The slide showed a comparative timeline. On one axis, the 12 civilizations most recently classified as extinct or in terminal cascade by the Consortium, including the famous Miratic collapse that Sollis himself had overseen. On the other axis, a set of behavioral indicators measured in the decades before classification. The data was sourced, and Mira had footnoted every single source in a reference column running along the side of the slide, in a font that was nearly too small to read but was clearly there, which told me she had prepared for someone to challenge her citations. The civilizations you classified as extinct, she said, all show the same behavioral signature in their final stages. Resource competition accelerating internal fracture, groups closing inward, knowledge being hoarded rather than shared. The cooperative structures breaking down at the local level first, then the regional level, then everywhere. She paused. Run that same behavioral analysis on Earth's current data, not the resource data, not the resource data, not the atmospheric data, the behavioral data. The question of what humans are actually doing with each other right now, at the ground level, in the zones your overview scans do not prioritize. Another click, and the new slide showed the behavioral analysis she had just described. Run on Earth. Present day. The pattern was not the same as the extinct civilizations. It was not the same because the cooperation lines, the ones that tracked knowledge sharing, mutual aid, cross-group resource coordination, and what Mira labeled simply as people helping each other without being told to, were not in decline. They were fragmented, yes, inconsistent, yes, messy, absolutely, but they were not collapsing. In several categories, particularly in the last 15 Earth years, they were accelerating. The hall made a sound I had never heard 8,000 academics make simultaneously. It was not quite a gasp. It was not quite silence. It was the sound of a very large number of very intelligent beings recalculating something at the same time. Sollis had stopped scrolling his data panel. He was looking at the screen. You built your classification model, Mira said, and her voice was still calm, still carrying no performance in it, which was somehow more powerful than if she had been shouting on civilizations that had already passed a particular threshold. The threshold where the cooperative behavior stopped. You identified the point of no return by studying civilizations that passed it. That is good science. I am not arguing with your methodology. She looked directly at Sollis. I am arguing with your assumption that we have passed it. The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that has a physical presence. You could feel it pressing against the walls. Sollis clasped his hands behind his back and said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled, and gave absolutely nothing away, the behavioral indicators you have presented are noted. However, the cascade data shows deterioration at a rate that the cooperative activity you describe would need to counteract at a scale not historically demonstrated by any Class 4 civilization. Mira nodded. Yes, historically, in civilizations you studied after they were already gone. A sound moved through the academic section that I can only describe as intellectual discomfort. The specific variety of discomfort that occurs when someone points out a methodological gap that everyone in the room had access to, and nobody had bothered to notice. You have no living examples, Sollis said, of a Class 4 civilization reversing a cascade of this magnitude. No, Mira agreed. I do not. You are absolutely right about that. She picked up her data unit. She clicked to her next slide. But I do have something else. The new slide was not a graph. It was not a map or a behavioral analysis or a comparative timeline. It was a list of names, hundreds of names, organized by region, by project type, by year of inception, names of people, and the things they had built. A 17-year-old from a coastal city who had started a marine reforestation network that had, by the time Mira filed her submission, expanded to 43 countries. A retired engineer in a landlocked nation who had developed a water reclamation system cheap enough to be replicated with locally available materials, which had then been replicated in over 200 locations without any central coordination. A group of teachers in a region with a collapsed formal education infrastructure who had built a distributed learning network reaching 8 million children using devices that most galactic civilizations would have considered obsolete. None of these people were famous. Not by Earth standards. Not by any standards. Their names meant nothing to anyone in that hall. These are not your leaders, Mira said. These are not your institutions. These are not the people your monitoring systems watch. These are the people your models do not count, because they do not have titles that register in your classification categories. She lowered her data unit. Every civilization you have classified was gone before you could ask anyone still living inside it what it felt like from the ground. You have studied collapse from the outside, from the after. I am standing inside it right now, telling you that from the ground it does not feel the way your models say it should feel at this stage. Pren made a noise beside me that I recognized as the sound she made when she was genuinely unsettled. Sollis was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that several delegates in the diplomatic rows visibly shifted in their seats. "What would you have this body do?" he said finally. "With what you have presented?" Mira answered without hesitation. "Do not classify us yet. Open a behavioral monitoring subfile. Assign an active observer instead of a passive scan. Give it 10 of your standard years. If the cooperative acceleration I have documented reverses course, if the ground-level behavior starts matching your extinction signature, reclassify then. But do not lock the file on data that is 50 years old and models that were built on civilizations nobody talked to while they were still alive." She said it the way you say something that you have rehearsed so many times it no longer sounds rehearsed. "Just true." 10 years, Sollis said. 10 years, Mira said. The hall began to talk. Not murmur, not shift, not politely whisper, talk. The delegate section was alive with movement. The academic rows were erupting in the particular kind of controlled frenzy that academics erupt into when a discussion has become genuinely unresolved. My recorder was picking up fragments from every direction, species I recognized and species I did not, all processing the same question. Was this a legitimate scientific challenge, or was this a desperate act by a species trying to avoid the obvious? I was watching Sollis, and I saw the thing that 20 years of covering him had taught me to watch for. The small, almost invisible moment when Carveran Sollis, who had never been wrong in 140 years of academic practice, encountered something he had not accounted for. His eyes moved briefly to the list of names still displayed on every screen in the chamber. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at Mira Vasili. "This body," he said, in a voice that carried the careful precision of someone choosing every word with both hands, "will take the counter-submission under formal deliberation. A vote on immediate classification will be suspended, pending review panel assessment of the behavioral data presented." The hall erupted. Not in the way halls erupt when something terrible happens. In the way halls erupt when something nobody expected just became real. Prenna was already transmitting. Every journalist in the gallery was transmitting. Delegates were on communication channels. Academics were arguing with each other across the rows with the focused intensity of people whose field had just been challenged in public and who were not sure yet whether to be offended or fascinated. Mira Vasili stepped back from the podium. She picked up her fabric bag. She looked at the chamber around her, 8,000 beings in various states of recalibration, and her expression was not triumphant. It was not relieved. It was the expression of someone who had done the thing they came to do and was now thinking about what came next. She walked back up the central aisle, back to Section 7, third tier, Observer Gallery. She sat down. She opened her outdated data unit and started typing. I filed my preliminary dispatch to the Interstellar Academic Press 12 minutes later. The headline I wrote was the most straightforward headline I had written in 20 years of covering galactic academia. It said, "Extinction vote suspended. Human woman with fabric bag walks into history." My editor transmitted back in 4 minutes. She never responds in 4 minutes. The message said only, "Get me the full story, get me the interview, whatever it costs." I looked down at my recorder and then across the chamber to where Mira Vasili was still sitting, still typing, still not looking up at the 8,000 people who were now, every single one of them, talking about her. The formal deliberation period was set for 90 standard days. What Mira Vasili had done in 20 minutes was not reverse an extinction classification. She had not fixed Earth. She had not erased the cascade data, or the fractured politics, or the atmospheric curves that bent in the wrong direction. She had not performed a miracle. What she had done was introduce doubt into a room that had not contained any. And doubt, in the academic world, is the most dangerous thing you can bring through the door, because doubt does not close files. Doubt holds them open, and an open file means time, and time, as every civilization that has ever clawed its way back from the edge of something terrible knows, is not nothing. Time is, in fact, everything. I gathered my equipment and began making my way towards Section 7, third tier. I had 100 questions. I had 20 years of professional instinct telling me how to ask them. I had an editor who wanted the full story. But mostly I had the feeling, rare enough in this career that I recognized it immediately when it arrived, that I had just watched something I would still be writing about when I was very old. The star map on the ceiling of the Grand Deliberation Hall of Verith Prime rotated slowly overhead, the way it always did, indifferent to what happened below it. And somewhere in the third tier of the observer gallery, a human with a 15-year-old data unit kept typing,